Yeah, better. I'm not. There was a light shining on me from over there. This is I'm blocking the view from those people instead of those people. Can't we? I think they should have put the screen a bit higher up, but there's a vent in the way. I could sit on the floor. Okay. So we've looked at a bit of the reasoning behind war memorials. We've looked at a bit of the language that's used on war memorials. We've looked at a few of the conflicts and disputes that were going on around various commemorations from one side of Barnsley to the other. And we've touched on just a few of the hundreds of memorials that there are out there to look at. Meanwhile, in Barnsley, and this second half of my talk is going to concentrate really on, with a few side excursions, but mainly going to concentrate on that big memorial out at the front. Because I think if you understand that, you understand a lot about the mindset of the people in Barnsley at the time. There was a public meeting called in 1920. The war had been over for nearly 2 years. A letter had been sent in November 1919 to the Barnsley Chronicle following the armistice, asking if a permanent cenotaph could be erected in Barnsley. Now, just to explain, the cenotaph down in Whitehall was originally only built in plaster and lath. It was wood and paint, and it was meant to be just there for the peace celebrations in June 1919, and then it was going to be demolished. But it was so popular with the people that came to visit it. So many wreaths were laid. People would take their hats off as they passed it. People in vehicles would slow down. It became obvious very rapidly to the government that they couldn't really knock it down. It would be disrespectful. So by July 1919, the decision was made to replace that plaster and lath cenotaph in Whitehall with the one that's there today, even though it's in the middle of the street and very inconvenient, I'm sure. So in 1919, a letter was sent to the Barnsley Chronicle suggesting that we have a similar construction. A cenotaph is actually an empty tomb, and I have heard people refer to the building at the front of the town hall as a cenotaph. It's not really a tomb shape, and it's got a man stuck on top, so technically it is not a cenotaph. Barnsley Council had up until that point been raising money for Beckett Hospital to pay off their various war loans, and they had managed to raise £20,000 by September 1920, which is pretty good going, but it does mean that everybody in Barnsley was fairly tired of putting their hands in their pockets. And remember the memorials we've looked at in the local churches, and then add on the chapels and the places of work. There's memorials in Redfern's Glass, in Wilson Brother Foundry, the Needham Brothers. All sorts of places have their own memorials. So everybody's been paying out for memorial after memorial. So now the council decide that they're going to start fundraising. The mayor writes an open letter to everybody in Barnsley, and he asks for them to contribute, and there at the bottom, any amount you're willing to give would be suitably acknowledged. It has now been decided to raise a memorial in Barnsley to the brave men and women from this neighbourhood. What he doesn't mention in that letter, and what causes some confusion for the first year or so, is that they were already fundraising for a memorial for the York and Lancaster Regiment, which of course was the regiment that included the two Barnsley Pals battalions. That was going to be a memorial put up on the Ype Menin Road and replicas placed in the towns of Sheffield, Barnsley, Rotherham and Pontefract. The memorial would cover all those who had served in the Barnsley battalions or in any section of the Yorks and Lancs Regiment. So we're confused again. We're simultaneously raising money for two memorials in Barnsley town centre. Again. A finally, they decided, being a lot more sensible than one would expect, that there was a proposal to make a grant to the Yorks and Lancs Fund from the Barnsley Fund and to combine the two fundraising activities. MP Fred Hall noted that Barnsley was going to be last in the field in the way of doing something to perpetuate the memories of these noble men. The design of the memorial would devolve upon the committee which was then formed of the great and the good. So the council were worried that they were going to be last and they were going to decide the design of the memorial without consulting the people. If you think I'm a little bit anti-council, you'd be right. In November 1920, this letter from the mayor, as I say, appeared in the Chronicle, and I just want to highlight a couple of phrases. Part of the scheme is to take the form of a monument of suitable design with the names of the fallen inscribed on it. The memorial will include all Barnsley men and women, and all who belong to any unit which was raised in or had its headquarters at Barnsley. There's technical for you. The committee also discussed sites for the memorial, for example at the top of Market Hill, in front of the proposed new town hall, because of course this building wasn't here then. This was shops and people's offices and such like. It could also have been in Lock Park, at the junction of Pontefract Road and Sheffield Road, where the Ebenezer Chapel is, where the Manx Arms is, or it's called Tykes now. Anyway, you're in the right thing. So here's the council being the council for you. Meanwhile, in Culloth, which is where I live, so I have a vested interest, Culloth's memorial was unveiled by the Mayor of Barnsley, Colonel W.E. Rayleigh, another one of the great and good. He lost 2 sons as well. On Thursday the 29th of July 1920. The inscription includes the words, "See ye to it that these shall not have died in vain," and space was left at the base of the memorial for names to be added. However, according to another piece I found in the Chronicle, this had still not happened 2 years later due to shortfall of funds. They only needed 50 quid. Culloth was full of miners, so maybe they didn't have very much money. The vicar read out the name of 161 heroes whose names would be engraved upon the memorial, and short addresses were made by clergymen from the Catholic and the Methodist churches as well. And I'd just like to add that the memorial, as you see it there on the right, was refurbished in 2004 by the Culloth Local History and Heritage Group with aid of funding from the Countryside Agency. And a book about all the men on the memorial, First and Second World War, was produced as part of the project, and is called West Culloth Forgets, and is still available for £5. If anybody wants one, I know where there's a box for. In Thurleston, they had one of these ambitious schemes, which, as we've seen, sometimes were a bit too much. They called a public meeting, and they had a scheme to lay out grounds and build an institute and laid out grounds at an estimated cost of £6,000. This is in 1920. I think you can tell what's going to happen. There was an alternative scheme, also with land donated by a local landowner for a less costly undertaking. A soldier's mother was quoted commenting that an institute might be very well for the district, but she would not answer the purpose of a memorial to those who had taken part in the war. She would like to see a marble monument erected and brass tablets inscribed with the names of the men who had served and those who had given their lives. The vicar was of the opinion that the memorial would be a failure if it was just a column of marble. It's that class conflict thing again. Of course, £6,000, they were whistling in the wind. They were never going to get that. And 3 years later, a brass tablet was unveiled in St Saviour's Church in Thurleston listing the men who'd lost their lives. So the vicar didn't have a column of marble disapproving of. The village didn't get their institute. And I do hope that the mum was Anglican rather than Methodist, because it's in the Church of England church. However, people power wins. Earlier this year, this memorial was dedicated on the corner of the junction in Thurleston, paid for by local people, organised by local people, made of local stone and carved by local artists. And I think it's very lovely. It says, "Lest we forget," up the side there. And it says, "In memory of those who served and those who fell." Very simple, very poignant, and it's very beautiful. It's sort of twists and around it. And tomorrow night in Thurleston Church and the Huntsman Pub in Thurleston, for some strange reason, they're launching a book about all the men on the Thurleston plaque and the men at Hoylandswain. The two villages have got together and they're doing a book jointly. So if you want to see me tomorrow night, I'll be in the pub. Back in Barnsley. They were considering these suitable sites, and they'd already appointed Mr. John Tweed, that we mentioned earlier, the eminent sculptor. Sites included the New Town Hall, the Manor House grounds, and that's where they ended up building the college, which is now the Barnsley University campus. The entrance to Lock Park, the junction of Sheffield Road and Doncaster Road, and Market Hill. So, 1921, they still weren't getting anywhere. Moat Breton, on the other hand, which is very appropriate, as we have a gentleman here from Moat Breton this evening. Their Working Men's Club had unveiled a roll of honour. There's that patriotic soldier that we saw at the beginning with his flag. My husband and I got in to photograph this when they were doing an evening of World War I songs in August for the centenary of the beginning of the war. It's much larger than you would imagine, actually. It's about 3 foot tall, that. Yeah. And they've got a Second World War one as well, and nobody had known about them before, but fortunately a gentleman had seen my bits and bobs in the newspaper and emailed me about it. That was unveiled by Captain G.B. Lancaster, who we mentioned earlier, one of the sons of the Lancaster family who were the estate agents. His uncle had been E.G. Lancaster, who had funded that convalescent home at the Vicarage at St Edmunds. And it's got the names of all the men in alphabetical order, including Mr. G.B. Lancaster there in the middle. I know it's very faint, but believe these there. Just names and initials, no ranks. It's in a working men's club, so I think that's very appropriate. So they got that, Roll of Honour. And then the church joins in. They get a lovely plaque. Oh dear, St. 22nd of Mary. I missed that one this morning. I'll change that before I go see it. Mary. Is that March? Or May? It's probably May. It is alphabetical by surname, but ranks, regiments and battalions are mentioned. So this is a gift. I'm not even thinking. This is a gift to anybody that wants to research the men that fell in Moat Breton, because you've got all the clues that you need to find the men. You've got their ranks, you've got their regiments and their battalions. It's brilliant. And you'll notice in the middle, we've got St George again. And can you just see underneath that poppy wreath? There's the dragon. So we've got St George killing the dragon. When it was unveiled, the vicar said, "When you catch a glimpse of the main figure of St George piercing the dragon, symbolical of evil, lift up your hands and hearts and go forth to your work to contend with the dragons of poverty, misery and despair, the dragons that spoil our beloved land. Tell them in the silent land, those who died for our freedom, in the silence, misery, loneliness and horror of warfare. Tell them that you who enjoy the good gifts of freedom, you who live, tell them that they have not died in vain." Got a bit choked now. Application was made to council to carve the names of the fallen men onto the pillars at the entrance of the recreation ground on Cross Street. This is actually on the opposite side of the road to where this memorial is now. If you've seen the bits in the Chronicle in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of stuff about having the years 1939-45 carved on it. There and there. It was in the paper this week, it's been done. But this was originally on the other side of the road, and it wasn't built as a war memorial. They were just the entranceway to the recreation ground, and to that folly at the far end of just where the land drops off Burton Bank. The application was made in November 1927, and the names were there by June 1928, because they're referred to again in the Chronicle. The pillars were moved across the road at some point where I haven't got to yet in my research, and the Second World War names were added to the base of the pillars. And I've been told this evening that there's a total of 95 names on that memorial now. Meanwhile, in the town, they realised that they were a bit over-ambitious. Their original scheme with Mr. Tweed, the respected sculptor, was going to cost £10,000. And my friends just told me that if you multiply that by 40, you won't be far out in modern day terms. So 10 times 40, £400,000. If a council today spent £400,000 on something, I don't think we'd be very happy. Even if it was a war memorial, to be honest. Council said at the time, in view of the trade depression and the long succession of industrial disputes, it has been found necessary to reconsider the war memorial scheme for Barnsley. The design had been approved by the subcommittee and the executive committee. A publicity subcommittee was formed, and £1,325 had been so far raised. But it had been decided to restrict the scheme, and they came to the conclusion in the end that they would ask Mr. Tweed to go away and redesign the whole thing for half the price. Mr. Tweed was not entirely pleased by this. Asked Mr. Tweed, the artist responsible for the design of the first memorial, to submit an alternative design, which, whilst being in every way appropriate for the purpose for which it was intended, would not cost more than £5,000 to carry out. The proposed memorial is 35 feet in height from the base to the head of the figure on the pedestal, and a figure of victory in bronze relief will be placed at the back of the pedestal. Now bear in mind that this is 1922, and if you cast your mind back to the poster for this talk and the slide that I showed at the very beginning, they had at this point a drawing of what the memorial was going to look like. So they knew it was going to have a soldier on the top, wearing a tin hat and a greatcoat. Just hold that thought. In 1922, the Mayor appeals for further funds. Of course, they're a bit embarrassed. He also mentions that now they've got the design and everything, that they're not going to have the names inscribed upon the memorial. It is proposed to have the names of the fallen inscribed on vellum and preserved with the records of the borough in the town hall. And right at the bottom, the memorial should be unveiled before the end of the present year. Yeah. Meanwhile, in 1922, and these are very quick slides because I just haven't got time to tell you about all of them, but maybe somebody will invite me back to do another talk, or maybe one of these other places will ask me to tell them about their memorial. So we've got Great Hutton's got a plaque, Fernscore's got a window, Broom Hill's got a plaque. Oh, that's a swimming baths now. Briley's got a memorial in the churchyard, Silkston's got a memorial in the churchyard. They moved it to the other side of the road. St Mary's has got that memorial chapel with that pink Gothic column. Musborough Dale's got a memorial in the churchyard. They've just brought out a book about theirs. I'm afraid I didn't bring it with me this evening. I'm sorry, I'm currently using it for some private research, and I took it out of the box. So everybody else is getting on with it. Everybody else is finding the funds, putting their memorials up and getting on with it. Meanwhile, in the town centre, they're coming up with wackier and wackier ideas to raise money for their memorial. This is a silver ballot. This is November 1922. First prize, £25, second prize a gold watch, and third prize £3. 10 prizes of 10 shillings each, 20 prizes of 5 shillings. They want you to buy books of tickets and sell them to all your friends and neighbours. Ballot papers, 6pence each, you may vote as often as you like. It made a loss. That was all I could find. I couldn't find who won what, how much money they actually raised, but they didn't make enough money back to cover the printing of the tickets and the prizes that they gave out. The best fundraiser was the band concerts in Lock Park. And these continued pretty much from immediately after the war right up to the memorial being unveiled. And by February 1923, the band concerts had raised £2,500. To be precise, £2,507, 2 shillings and 5pence. Unfortunately, as a consequence of raising so much money through band concerts in Lock Park, which I guess were an excuse for people sitting on the grass and having a bit of picnic and maybe drinking the odd bottle of beer, Captain G.B. Lancaster resigned from the committee because he objected to the manner in which the money was being raised, which is a bit sad, because he actually had gone to war and he had fought. In April of 1923, they announced that there would be a memorial football match at Oakwell between the police force and the licensed victuallers. Now, I imagine the police force were all strapping fit young men, and the licensed victuallers were probably all getting on a bit with beer bellies. I actually don't know who it was, but one imagines it was probably the police force. It did raise a substantial amount of money, over £100, so it was a jolly good day out. And again, probably just the straw that broke the camel's back for poor old Captain G.B. Lancaster. Maybe he didn't like eating pies and drinking beer either. He might have approved of this one though. The Barnsley Gilvan Society presented Gilbert and Sullivan's Pirates of Penzance, preceded by the short operetta Cox and Box, which sounds a bit odd, so I googled it. Apparently it's a mini opera about two lodgers who share a room. One works the night shift and one works the day shift, and it's what happens when they meet when one of them has a day off. Cox and Box, I don't get it, but I'm sure it's very entertaining. Is it really? Oh, see, I learn something new every day. I guess that this was probably well out of the reach of the everyday people to go and see, because the tickets were 3 and 6, 2 and 4, or even in the pit, 1 and 3s, which to me sounds like a lot of money for those days. I can't imagine that your common and garden miner, glass worker, or lady that worked in one of the linen factories went to see them. Maybe Mr. G.B. Lancaster supported that one. I didn't put any dates on any of those adverts because they had film shows, they had concerts, they had all sorts of dances, tea dances, all sorts of things that were just in the paper. If I'd have read all the adverts, we could have just done a talk on adverts, trying to fundraise. Meanwhile, the names, because I keep harping on about these names, because it's my particular bugbear. A letter from the town clerk in the Barnsley Chronicle in March 1923, asking people to submit a postcard with the following particulars: the full name of the soldier, sailor or nurse, the rank of the soldier or rating of sailor, the regiment or ship, and the date of death. And what he wanted was the names of soldiers, sailors and nurses resident in Barnsley, remember Barnsley was smaller in those days, who fell in the Great War, and the names of soldiers resident in the immediate neighbourhood, not specified, but one imagines they spread out as far as the modern borough, who served in the 13th, 14th, 15th, they're the 2 Barnsley Pals battalions and the reserve battalion, and the 5th, which is the territorial, who lived anywhere in the neighbourhood. What happened to everybody that lived in Barnsley? a disgruntled gentleman who only signs himself Coyley, King's Own Yorkshire Light Infantry, writes the following week, "In my opinion, the policy should be all or none. Many Barnsley boys joined His Majesty's forces long before the local battalions had either been suggested or formed." And remember the men in the regulars and the men in the reserves who were called up at the beginning? "It seems to me rather unfair to those who joined up voluntarily in 1914 or 1915 in units other than the Orcs and Lancs to make way for those who had, of compulsion, in other words after conscription, many of them, joined up later on and were sufficiently fortunate to serve in the battalions mentioned." The town clerk's letter does reappear a couple of times in the newspapers, but then it sort of fizzles out. So here we have another conflict, and it is not resolved. And despite Coyley really hoping that probably the point has been fully discussed by the committee and satisfactory reasons can be produced as the decision at which they have arrived. But it is Barnsley's war memorial. Surely it should be representative of the whole of Barnsley. Butchering going on in my office. Meanwhile, in the rest of Barnsley, Thurston's got that plaque that we saw, that nice brass plaque. In St John's, the vicar, the Reverend Mr Huggard, has plaques put up to his two sons. I do feel sorry for the vicars. They nearly all lost their sons, and the Rayleys and the Lancasters and the Hewitts and all of them. It's the officers, you see. They're there in their sand brown belts, waving their pistols, leading their men, most of them, are brave young chaps. And the German snipers have got, oh, an officer P. 17% casualties amongst the officers compared to 11 or 12 for the enlisted men. Dodworth had their war memorial. Barnsley has that sportsman's memorial. In Darton Working Men's Club, there was a Roll of Honour, also lost. If anybody knows where the Roll of Honour from Darton Working Men's Club went, please tell us. Grimethorpe has a lovely big memorial outside the church. Penistone had a side chapel with names engraved on the panels on the walls. Penistone had a brilliant idea. They actually put up a wooden replica of their war memorial in the market square for a few months before they decided that was what they were definitely going to have, so that everybody could get used to looking at it and walking around it. In 1924, things were looking a bit more promising. The fund now stood at £4,500. However, the price of the memorial, Mr Tweed's bill, had gone up a bit, so they still had £650 to be raised. The mayor writes again, asking people. He says the statue is being prepared by Mr Tweed, the eminent London sculptor, and is now completed. The present sum has been raised, even the balance to be raised at £650. He proposes a forget-me-not flower day and a mile of pennies. The forget-me-not flower day raised £102, 1 shilling and sixpence, and the mile of pennies raised £6, 9 shillings and 7pence. It doesn't say how long they managed to get their mile. One thing that was also held in Barnsley immediately after the war were these drumhead services in Lock Park. And while I've got you all captive, I think it would be really great if we did this in 2016 to mark the first day of the Battle of the Somme when the pals went over the top, and all the other lads, of course. They held it on the Sunday nearest to the 1st of July, and if you were watching that memorial service at the Albert Hall on Saturday night, when they piled all the drums up and then draped the flags over the top, it was like that. There are pictures in the Chronicle of them all sitting around these drums with proper chairs. So somebody had a heck of a job carrying chairs from all the nearby chapels and churches and people's houses. But they had processions, all the ex-servicemen marched up there. It sounds like it was a really... And it was the summer as well, not November, when it might rain on you, it was in July. Well, it was a really good idea. We should have one then, in 2016, I think. and they had the bands playing. And they had a cricket match, so they'd had a football match, now they had a cricket match between members of the town council and officials of the council. They couldn't get anybody else to volunteer, so the council played themselves. That raised £204. It was a cricket match, so obviously the people that went had a little bit deeper pockets than people at the football match. In 1924, Gorber got their memorial in the churchyard. There was a memorial placed in the grounds of the National Reserve Club on Harbour Hills Road, which is where the electricity substation was before they knocked that down. I discovered a couple of days ago that my husband's uncle, who used to be a bus driver for Yorkshire Traction and was on the committee of Yorkshire Traction when that was their social club, was one of the people responsible for getting the National Reserve Society's memorial moved from Harbour Hills Road to the garden outside the Cooper Gallery, which is where it is now, hidden amongst the trees at the back. That's quite cool. A family claim to fame. In Darton, they had a memorial window and a plaque to Captain Cyril Dixon, the son of a local landowner. And in Barnsley St George's, the vicar there got the window for his son. As I say, the vicar's got badly done to. In Musborough, the curate who was killed, he was called George DeVille. And the soldiers apparently called him George DeVille Smith. The soldiers called him Devil Smith, not DeVille Smith, because he was quite harsh, which I think was a bit odd for a curate. But they respected him, but he was tough. He didn't survive the first day of the Battle of the Somme, like so many of them. I haven't even got an aside to tell you what Barnsley Council's doing in 1924 and early 1925, because they weren't. The Yorks and Lancs Memorial was unveiled in St Mary's Church. That's a bit of a brass tablet, it's not very impressive. The nice one for the Yorks and Lancs regiments in Sheffield Cathedral. At Hoyland, the memorial at Kirkbolk was unveiled, which I gather was rededicated this last Saturday with an extra couple of hundred names. At Wather-upon-Dearne, which is almost in our area, there was a tablet placed in the church. And at Penistone Grammar School, they had a memorial bookcase in the library. Now, Penistone Grammar School has moved, and the memorial at Penistone Grammar School is now a shiny aluminium-y plaque on a boulder in the car park. So I'm looking for a memorial bookcase. Anybody seen one? Lost one oak bookcase. And look, down there at the bottom, those of you at the back probably can't see, Barnsley War Memorial. Yay! Unveiled on the 11th of October 1925. And here's a photograph I've taken from the council's website, from Yokoko. Those of you that don't know, it's a lovely website full of lots and lots and lots of pictures. And most people can't find it, but Google Yokoko when you get home and you will be there for days. I did have a Barnsley Chronicle photograph, but it wasn't anywhere near as good, so I've used this one. Apparently, the final cost of the memorial was in the vicinity of £5,500. There were various amounts stated in the various newspaper cuttings, so I've just rounded it up. The council had asked for help with the finance from the Barnsley Prisoners of War Fund, who had a little surplus left over after the war, because at the point that the memorial was unveiled, they still owed Mr Tweed £249. But the Barnsley Prisoners of War Fund used their money to build some houses for ex-servicemen in Kendry instead. And no money, as far as I'm aware, was given to the Yorks and Lancs Memorial Fund, as they had promised back in 1920. Somebody can prove me wrong if you want, but I haven't found any mention of it. There was a bit of a hoo-ha in the August, just before it was unveiled, when Mr Tweed, or at least somebody who knew Mr Tweed, pointed out that the bronze of the soldier on top was cast in Brussels. And the committee in Barnsley got a bit snippy and said that they would not have let the work go out of England if they had known. In the Yorkshire Post and Leeds Intelligencer, a newspaper, Mr. Tweed responded that he had a good relationship with the firm in Brussels, knew that they did good work, and they also quoted a lower price. He took the view that art has no geographical boundaries, and that the Barnsley Committee were being petty towards the little country who were our allies in the past war. I think Belgium probably needed the money, don't you? They were absolutely devastated by the war. If they gave us the lowest quote on tender, why not? And in reference to design, the committee also objected to the soldier in his steel hat and greatcoat. However, by the time the committee had seen Mr. Tweed's design, the work was already in hand. This is 3 years ago they saw that design. I don't think they've got a leg to stand on. Alderman Rayleigh, who was the mayor when the armistice was called, of Rayleigh's solicitors, said, "Many of us have no wish to perpetuate the glories of war with a soldier in full dress, but now is not the time for bickering. Let us remember the feelings of those who are related to the glorious dead, whose memories we are endeavouring to perpetuate." So he calmed the rest of the council down a bit and told them to stop being silly. Apparently on the day of the unveiling, the morning threatened rain, but the weather held out fine, and in the afternoon it was possible to carry out the ceremony under conditions which, for the time of year, could almost be described as real. Ideal. Real. I'm getting tired now. Spectators were apparently seen on the roof of St Mary's Church and on the roof of the post office. And can you see them? Hanging out the window of this building here at the back. Apparently one man was even spotted sat on a chimney top. At the dedication, there was a procession by the police, a guard of honour from the 5th Yorkshire Lancs, from ex-servicemen and from the St John's Ambulance. There is a list in Barnsley Archives of 136 family groups or individuals with their names and addresses of persons desirous of placing a wreath. So if you have a feeling that your family lived in a town centre in the immediate post-war years, you might find their names on this list in Barnsley Archives. It will say something like Mrs. Allenby and daughter, and give their address. So you can look them up. After the wreath laying, representatives of military detachments, the Territorials, the British Legion, who had formed by then, because we're in 1925, 7 years after the end of the war, and the National Reserve, who had told their men to wear their decorations, marched past and saluted the memorial. In the following week's Barnsley Chronicle, it said, in the editorial, "To live in the hearts we leave behind is not to die." We were remembering them. They lived in our hearts. So those men lived on. And you might think that's the end of my story. But actually, there's a few more bits and bobs. Just to whisk you around the last 5 minutes. In September 1926, a gentleman who called himself merely Economy wrote this snippy letter to the Chronicle, suggesting that I wish to protest against the gross extravagance and lack of foresight displayed by the War Memorial Committee in the erection of a useless block of stone at the top of Regent Street. Now, before you get annoyed with him, he's got a point. A really thoughtful body would have foreseen that the municipal memory does not carry over a period of more than 7 years, and at the expiration of that time, this memorial, like the tank in the park, will be an obsolete nuisance. How much better, therefore, it would have been to construct this temporary affair of nice large blocks of coal, which could, in the fullness of time, be carted down to Barnsley Electric Works and used in the interests of economy. Some of you might be aware that they parked a World War I tank in Lock Park after the war. It actually didn't fit through the park gates, so they had to crash it through the wall to get it into the park. I read that out to the kids at Burtwood School last week and they thought it was hilarious. And they wanted to know if it was still there. I had to tell them that 7 years after the war, the council sold it for scrap. Which is what economy is saying. If you can sell the tank for scrap, are you going to get rid of the memorial as well? There were several letters thinking that he really meant this, which is quite funny, but if you want to go over it, it goes on for a couple of weeks. And then finally a gentleman writes in to support him, and they published this lovely poem. I'm amazed the Chronicle got away with this actually. When Conchies skulked. The Conchies' work has but begun, they've scrapped the tank and sold the gun. The Bolshies, Cranks and Co. rejoice, and in the Chronicle give voice. Next, poor old Locke will have to go, the proletarian horde to show that capital must be pulled down, and in his place they'll stick some clown who stayed at home while tank and gun destroyed the menace of the Hun, while Barnsley soldiers fought and died to save some coward's precious hide. Now, there's an actual point to this. Barnsley only had, apparently, according to the gentleman that spoke in this very room on Saturday afternoon, 12 conscientious objectors, but several of them had got onto the council by this time. And by 1930, one of them was the mayor, a certain Edward Sherian. And he actually did not invite, I won't say banned, because it wasn't quite that proactive, he did not invite the British Legion to his Mayor's Day when he took office, because he didn't want them to give a militaristic display. So in return, when it came round to the next drumhead service in Lock Park, the British Legion said, we're not coming. We're going to go to our own service in another church because we are not marching past the memorial and doing eyes right to a Conchi. And it's at this point that I think, 1930, remember nothing's happened with the names yet. It's at this point that I think that the whole project of the names inscribed upon vellum or anywhere else became doomed. Because the people that were in power in Barnsley Council at that time didn't really want to remember the war anymore. And they were supported by people in surprisingly high places. This is from the Chronicle in November 1930. The Bishop of Durham made a rather piquant suggestion last week that the annual commemoration of the signature of the armistice, which brought hostilities in the Great War to an end, should cease entirely. The Bishop of Durham. This article goes on for several columns and was written by a serviceman because he mentions that at the point the armistice was signed, it was a very nice November day, because you remember sitting in the grounds of the hospital that he was in, recovering from his wounds. And he finishes his piece. As long as there are living representatives of those who passed from us while bearing the heat and burden of the day, as long as we gather around the memorials up and down the country to keep, so long shall we gather around the memorials up and down the country to keep their memory green. And he noted that in Barnsley, on that armistice day that had just passed, he noticed men engaged on high girders on a building near the site of the memorial were seen silhouetted against the perfectly clear blue sky as if they were statues during the 2-minute silence. That makes me think about that picture of the men sitting on the big high girder in New York on the Empire State Building eating their sandwiches. So everybody stopped in those days on Armistice Day. The serviceman goes on to comment that the poppy wreaths were laid by the respectful crowd, and they did not just signify the blood flowing freely for the country's sake, but also that we should look after those who have returned and who still bear the signs, even after all these years, of service for their country. May the country which never forgets the glorious dead, words used all the time, may the country which never forgets the glorious dead never forget the living. And that would be a really good place to stop. I find a couple more bits. There's an editorial in the Chronicle in 1932 relating some of the history I've told you today. They were proposing to put the names of the fallen on vellum and preserve them with the records of the borough in the town hall. In 1923, the town clerk issued an announcement asking for particulars of the men. The new town hall will be completed soon, says this editorial in the Chronicle. And this would be an opportune time to restart the project of collecting names. As far as I know, nothing was ever done. This is the last mention of the names I've found so far. But bear in mind that searching the Barnsley Chronicle, even digitally, is a very long drawn-out process. And you never know, I might find something. However, the archives know of no records. And I'm hoping against hope that those postcards sent in to the town clerk in 1916 and in 1923 might yet turn up in a box somewhere, in a cellar or an attic. Surely they wouldn't have thrown them away. It would be really helpful if we had that list. And really, really finally, in 1933, one of the councillors suggested that they moved it. That they pick the whole valley lot up and stick it in Lock Park, which is where they put things they don't want anymore. Fortunately, and I think he was on our side, I'm getting to quite like Colonel W.E. Grayley, the leader of the council declared it would be a tremendous mistake to suppose that the war memorial could be so removed without hurting the feelings of thousands of people, and asked for it to be struck from the minutes. The words had been said though, and as you'll see, this is in the Manchester Guardian. It actually appears in newspapers all over the country, and the argument continues for 6 or 9 months in the Chronicle, even though they'd struck it from the minutes. The thought that a councillor could be so insensitive as to suggest moving the war memorial. Obviously it's still there. There it is. There's still no names on it. There's still names inscribed upon vellum and a roll of honour. But I'm very, very proud to, since I started doing the research for this talk, in fact quite recently, beginning of this year, to be part of a committee of the Barnsley War Memorials project, which has been set up to record all of the war memorials all over Barnsley and to create a roll of honour of the fallen, of the men from the First World War, from the whole of Barnsley, from Thurleston to Thurnscoe, from Royston to Tankersley. I have to think about that. There's too many Thurs in Barnsley. What was it like with Bob Thor in medieval times? If any of you would like to know more, that's our website. I've also got some leaflets on the front desk. And we're applying for Heritage Lottery funding in the next few months. And as part of that, there are certain things that we have to say that we've done. And hopefully this talk this evening has gone a little way to that. Because some of the suggestions the Heritage Lottery have given us are that people will learn more about the heritage, that heritage will be better explained. I think I might have done that. Yep. That heritage will be identified and recorded. We're doing that. And that more and a wider range of people will engage with heritage. Well, the children at Burkle School were quite impressed the other day. And I'm doing Churchfields day after tomorrow. And I'm available for booking, and I don't charge if it's children. So, thank you very much for listening, and that is the end of my talk. And you've probably got just a few minutes for questions before we get thrown out.